This is an Aaton XTR Super 16mm film camera. A few months ago, myself and some friends took one of these models and shot a little short film with it. So today I'm going to show off the details of how to use the Aaton XTR itself, dive into it, and show off a little bit of black and white footage that we shot with some very expired film. Ooh, very nice. This specific Aaton model is the Aaton XTR PROD, and it is the highest end model that was put out in the XTR series. There was the XTR, the XTR Plus, and the XTR PROD. Besides the XTR series, there's also the earlier Aaton LTR, the later Aaton XTR, and the Aaton a-minima, which is a bit of an oddity in that it took 200-foot rolls of 16mm instead of the standard of either 100 or 400-foot rolls. This Aaton belongs to Lift, the liaison of independent filmmakers of Toronto. Mentioned them in some videos before. That's where I'm doing this video today and how I have access to this camera. And you can find information down in the description below if you live in Toronto or the surrounding area. Amazing artist resource. This is the body of the Aaton itself. So at the front you have the PL lens mount. There's a shutter inside along with viewfinder optics up here. There's an LCD display so you can view a variety of information when you're shooting, and you can also use it to set your frame rate options for the camera, so the speed that the film is moving through the camera. There's also the film gate in this area in the back here where the magazine will go into, and the area where on this model we have a battery sleeve, but sometimes there's just a 4-pin port for plugging in your power supply to power the battery. The Aaton takes a magazine that looks like this. It's a coaxial magazine, so it takes film on one side, transports it to the other, and it is shockingly easy to load and put onto the camera. There's no complex threading, and all you need to do is a small portion of it in complete darkness, and then the rest can be loaded into the magazine on the take-up side with the lights on. And then it just simply slides onto the camera. So I'm gonna load a little bit of dummy film into this, so film that has been exposed to the light, not film that is unintelligent. Zing, great joke. Wow, if you knew things about film, you'd be laughing right now. So I'm gonna do that and show off the loading of this magazine, and then we're gonna put it onto the camera, turn it on, and go through some of the functions as well. The Aaton magazines are very easy to load. They are coaxial mags, which means the film is transported from this supply side over to this side, which is the take-up. This is a 400-foot magazine for 16mm film. There did also exist a 800-foot magazine for these Aaton cameras, but that's less common. First, remove the magazine cover if you have one. This front area is the pressure plate, and it's where our film loop will be once the magazine is loaded. To open up the compartments, there is a latch on the bottom of both sides. In the supply side, we have the spindle for the roll of film, a roller, and the area where the film goes through to the opposite side of the mag. The spindle has little tabs that click in and pop out for securing the film into place. Make sure these are clicked in for loading. And on the inside of the door is the mechanical footage counter. Make sure this is clicked into the upwards position for loading the film. This magazine takes rolls of film on plastic cores, and these rolls need to be handled in complete darkness using either a darkroom, a changing bag, or a changing tent. You also need an empty core for the take-up side. This magazine will not take 100-foot rolls of film on daylight spools. In complete darkness, place your fresh film onto the spindle and press the middle to engage the tabs for locking the core into place. The film needs to feed clockwise off the roll with the perforations down. It goes on the left side of the roller, and then feeds up through the slot to the other side. Feed a few inches of film through the slot to be sure that it comes out to the other side. Close the compartment and be sure to latch it closed. The rest of this process can safely be done with the lights on. The footage counter can be engaged by twisting it clockwise, and the roller makes contact with the film so you can see how large the roll is in both feet and meters. As you run the film through the camera, this counter will move all the way down to 0. On the opposite side, we can see the film coming through the slot. Pull enough film through to feed it into the top of the magazine. It will come out of the front of the magazine at the top and then can be fed back in through a slot at the bottom. Put an empty core on the spindle and press the middle to engage the tabs for locking the core into place. As you pull film through, you need to make an appropriate sized loop for the camera. The loop of the film should have 15 or 16 perforations visible, and the easiest guide for this is to put 2 fingers between the magazine and the film for correct spacing. Pull the film through and put it into the slot of the core, making a little fold in the film to help secure it. Rotate the core counterclockwise to take up some of the film. Now we need to properly feed it through the rollers. It goes under the first roller, and then there are 2 rollers with pins that engage with the film sprockets. These have small guides that swing out of the way. Put the film around the top roller and be sure it engages with the perforations. Once it's sitting properly, click the guide back into place. Repeat this for the sprocket roller on the bottom, and then it goes under the last roller before the core. Be sure that the film loop size is maintained while doing this. You can rotate the core a few times to be sure that the film is moving properly. Close the compartment, and it's best to put some tape at least over the latches of a loaded magazine on both sides. The magazine engages with a magnetic motor in the camera, which spins this part to transport the film. You can see the film move by rotating this part manually. These magazines are different from older style ones which move the film from left to right. These are called displacement magazines and involve pulling out a large film loop for threading inside the camera body. The Aaton magazines have all their threading done within the magazine and now are ready to just slot right into the camera. Now with a roll loaded into the camera, you can see the film that is at the very front here, and this is what will go into the gate of the camera itself. It's always good to, as I mentioned in the loading portion, throw a little bit of tape at least over the latches of the magazine so that nothing happens. You don't accidentally open it up when it's running or when you're handling it, because that would be the worst thing that could possibly happen. For actually loading the magazine onto the Aaton, it's very, very simple, as I mentioned. This one has a little magnetic cover for the film gate. These are always really useful because it's very, very important to protect just a number of areas on this camera. The shutter area, the film gate, things where there are physically moving components of the camera that are integral to its functioning. And the magazine just slots right into the camera like that. And it is entirely secure. There's no more threading or anything that really needs to be done for the film to engage with the camera itself and be fitting into the gate properly. It's all pretty much ready to go once you have loaded the film into the magazine, attach the magazine to the camera. Amazing, you're shooting Super 16. The Aaton XTR is powered entirely by 12 volts, which means that you can get a pretty nice small power source for this camera. We have these long batteries, I like to call them chocolate bars, just because they're in the shape of a bar, I guess. And this specific model has a battery sleeve on this side of the camera where it will take the power source. So all I have to do is slot this into the camera. Not all cameras have these ones. It is entirely removable using this knob. You pull it out, and then there's just a port for a 4-pin power cable, which is pretty standard. So even if I didn't have this, I could get a nice long cable, drape it around the tripod, attach it to myself, and I would still be able to easily kind of power the camera. In the past, you might have also needed a battery belt, but luckily we don't really need to use these anymore. So you would have kind of attached this to yourself. There's ports on it for plugging in, charging the batteries in it, and then you can plug into the camera and carry this around when you're using the camera itself to power it. But luckily, times have changed, so no more battery belts. With the battery in the camera, we now have access to the options on the LCD display and our actual run test switch. So on this one, it's actually like a knob that will move left or right. On certain other models, it might be like a button, and the LCD display on other models might have less options for the information that you can show. When you initially put on the magazine, you want to flip this over to test, and this will advance the film 1 frame so that it will kind of settle into the gate and everything should be properly functioning. You might initially hear like a click when the film is moving and settling in on the first try, but you should only hear a click when you do the initial test. If you continue to do test afterwards and you're still hearing clicks, then it means there's probably something not sitting right in the magazine of the camera. Your film might be not loaded properly, your loop might be a little too big. Whatever it is, you should only be hearing that first click. So there might be a click here. And if you hear no click at all on the very first test, then that is also a good sign. Just run it a few times and make sure that you're not hearing anything. It's just advancing the film 1 frame. So now, if I toggle this over to run, then the film should be running pretty quietly through the camera. The Aaton XTR is an incredibly quiet camera because it is a sync speed camera. So you have a variety of frame rate options on here that will run at a constant locked in frame rate so that you can sync audio later on. And because you're recording audio on set, you want the camera to be incredibly quiet. So this camera right now, while I'm talking, is running at 24 frames per second, and I can barely hear it when I'm standing next to it. The test option is also useful for checking the gate between shooting. This means looking at the gate to be sure that it's clean and there's nothing such as a hair in the gate that would impact your exposed footage. You can also remove the magazine to clean the gate with a brush or a blower. The Aaton XTR has an airy PL lens mount on the front of it, which means that you can get some incredibly nice, incredibly high-end lenses for using on these cameras. All we have to do to remove the body cap is this ring that locks into place, and that's what we will move as well when we're putting the lens onto the camera. We just rotate it and we can remove the body cap. And again, you want to be very careful when the camera is open like this because the shutter is in here. And that's an incredibly significant part of the camera. And because it's a film camera, these are all mechanical things. There's moving components inside of this body, as opposed to something like a high-end digital camera, something like a RED, where you remove it and you can see the digital sensor. You don't want to touch or mess with the digital sensor, of course, but it's just a little bit different on cameras like these where there are physically moving components inside the body that have to work in order for the footage to be exposed properly. So if we have the lens off, we flip this to test and we can see it will expose 1 frame of film. The shutter will move out of the way, and then we can see the film in the gate. And then when we go back, the shutter will move back into place. So if we start running, then we'll be able to see it will start running, and this camera is set to run at 24 frames per second. So it will start spinning. And it's hard to even see on this camera, this digital camera, because this digital camera is running at a very similar frame rate. So they're almost in sync, but you can see it as it slows down. And it stops perfectly into place. So this is a 25mm ARRI lens in a PL mount, and all I have to do to attach it is make sure that the little notches around the barrel of the mount are going to properly lock in and sit in place on the lens mount of the body. So there's these areas here where it needs to sit. And there's a little peg here as well that needs to sit onto the little notch on the tabs that are around here. There's not a peg for every tab, but just the one that sits up here needs to line up properly with that peg. And then we lock it into place by rotating the ring, and the lens is mounted properly on the camera. As the shutter inside the camera spins, it is splitting the light between the film gate and the viewfinder. So the opening on the disc of the shutter is where the light enters and hits the film, but as it's spinning, the rest of the disc is a mirror that will send the light up through the viewfinder so you can actually see what you're shooting. It is a reflex camera, so you'll be able to see the focus and the aperture change when you actually adjust them on the lens. The viewfinder at the top of the body can pivot around. It has a few little areas where you can loosen it to turn. This one at the top, as you loosen it, you then have to rotate the ring as well to move it into a position where the viewfinder can pivot up and down like this. And this is just to adjust the angle at which you might be viewing from and make it more comfortable for yourself. And then it spins back to the tighten area, and then you tighten it. This one down here, closer to the actual body of the camera, is where you will loosen it to pivot it around the front. So either the left side of the camera or the right side of the camera. So if I'm on this side of the camera, I can adjust the viewfinder so that I can view on this side comfortably. And then I can actually see the focus and the aperture adjust. It's not the easiest and the most friendly depending on the viewfinder or like the eye cup that you have on for people with glasses, but this is the life we lead. This silver ring up here is not something for adjusting the movement of the viewfinder. It is for setting the diopter. And the diopter is the actual focus inside the viewfinder. And you want to set that when you're initially using the camera to make sure that you're actually accurately seeing everything in focus in the viewfinder. Because the viewfinder itself has pieces that will move for focusing the display, as opposed to when you're just focusing the lens and you're seeing the focus of the image change within the viewfinder. The viewfinder also has an iris that will open or close by rotating a ring by the eyepiece. This stops light from entering the viewfinder and prevents you from seeing through it if it's in the closed position. There are also viewfinder extension accessories that can be attached to make it easier to use the viewfinder when you're operating the camera from further away. Inside the viewfinder, we have a ground glass screen, and it has frame lines on it to help us frame properly for Super 16. Because this camera is Super 16, it has the appropriate ground glass gate inside, so it just helps you to have frame lines to frame properly for that. There are a variety of ground glass screens out there for the Aatons. We only have the one that is in the camera. It lives in the camera. They can be swapped out, but I won't be showing that in this video because it's a very delicate process and something that most people won't have to do. In that area inside that says 1.66, that's the ground glass screen that can be removed if you have a different one to swap out. You can't change the gate physically of this camera to change like the aspect ratio that's being exposed onto the film. It is Super 16 gate, so you're exposing a Super 16 image. But you can adjust the lens mount here. This says Super 16. Certain models, you can change it to expose only regular 16. So you're not changing the gate, you're just changing the positioning of the lens so it's only covering a regular 16 frame. The conversion from Super 16 to regular 16 on this camera is a delicate one, and like changing the shutter angle and the focusing screens, shouldn't be attempted by anyone inexperienced. On this side of the camera is where we have our LCD display. While you're shooting, the LCD display will show the frame rate that you've selected and then also the footage of the film in the magazine. So this will count down as you're shooting. You initially set it when you put the magazine onto the camera. You don't have to, but it's a helpful reminder. Although you also have the physical footage counter on the magazine that will move as you're shooting as well. There's a variety of different options for the Aaton XTR PROD model that you select entirely through the LCD display system. And we have the little buttons underneath it here. So let's dive a little closer into those options. The display on the side of the Aaton XTR PROD is where we access a variety of settings for the camera. There are 5 buttons below the display, and there's also a knob near the bottom of the camera which rotates for selecting certain things in the menu. Sometimes the display will flash no code, which is actually something you don't have to worry about now as it pertains to unnecessary timecode accessories which would have been used in the past. You're very unlikely to use these now, and you can clear this warning by pressing any button. The display will show us the selected frame rate on the left and the amount of remaining footage in the magazine on the right. This area will be blank though if no magazine is loaded. Here the camera is set to run at 24 frames per second. The XTR PROD has preset speeds of 6, 12, 18, 20, 23.98, 24, 25, 29.97, 30, 36, 40, 48, 60, and 75 frames per second. It also has options for specific frame rates from 3 to 75 frames per second in 0.001 increments. These are all crystal controlled speeds, which means it runs exactly at the number you select. Pressing set and sync allows you to select a preset speed by either pressing the sync button to cycle through them or by using the knob. Pressing set and EX/VAR allows you to select a specific frame rate by rotating the knob. Pressing set and then the EX/VAR button twice sets the camera to run off an external speed device if you have that accessory. We can set the ASA or ISO of our film stock by pressing set and ISO, and then either tapping the ISO button or rotating the knob to select the proper setting. This is intended for the internal light meter reference, which is also not used often anymore either. It's not necessary to set this for shooting, only if you're using that internal light meter. Pressing the battery/ISO button will display the voltage of the battery. Pressing the mag/elapse button will display the amount of footage that has elapsed. And pressing it twice will display the ID of the magazine. The Aaton magazines have a subtle indicator on them which will assign a letter to the magazine in the display menu. This magazine is mag B, and these magnetic receivers here make contact with a magnet in the camera when loaded. The system then remembers how much footage is in the magazines if magazines are swapped. The XTR PROD can detect 7 different magazines. When loading a new magazine, press set and the mag button twice for it to display 400 feet. You can also dial in a different amount of footage in the magazine if you're shooting a smaller roll by pressing set and mag and then rotating the knob. Those are all of the significant features of the menu. The screen may also display a few different warnings related to low speed, low battery, and empty magazines, and you can find more information on that again in the Aaton XTR PROD manual. I would never run the camera at such a high frame rate without film in the camera because it's not healthy for the mechanisms that are moving without that friction and tension of the film that should be there. But this is set to 75 frames per second, and I showed earlier how quiet it was at 24. 75 is, you can definitely hear it because it's running that film real fast through this camera. Louder, but not as loud as definitely like significantly older film cameras that would have been very, very loud. Like compare this against the sound of a Bolex running at like the highest that it can go for frame rate, like 60 or 50 frames per second. Big difference. When you're not selecting things on the little menu here, the knob at the bottom actually controls the Aaton Glow. The Aaton Glow is, there's a little light system inside the viewfinder, and you can turn it up or down and it will illuminate the frame lines of the ground glass screen on the viewfinder so that you can see it a little easier in dark situations. And there's also a little switch down here, which originally controlled the built-in light meter system of the camera. Not all of these cameras still have that or have a functioning one, and it's something that I don't really encourage or suggest people use. Just learn to use a handheld light meter. It's an incredibly powerful tool, and especially when you're working at a level with a camera like this, better to go off of that than like a built-in light meter. But this would turn the display in the viewfinder on or off on the Aatons that have a light meter. Down here is a little 5-pin LEMO connector that originally would have been used for Aaton code, time code accessory units that you don't need anymore. It's not necessary. Some models would actually have the ability to imprint time code, like what was called Aaton code, which was a series of codes that would be imprinted and exposed onto the film every few feet between the perforations as it ran through the camera. A lot of that stuff is now pretty obsolete because you're just going to have your film digitized and you're going to cut it that way, as opposed to physically working with it, where you would probably benefit from having some time code or code exposed as you're running it through the camera. On this side of the camera, as I mentioned, is the battery sleeve, and this can be removed by unscrewing this connector and then pulling it off. And it's really just secured into place and then has a 4-pin connector on the front here. So it's really nothing super special. It's just a very easy way of mounting the battery, one of these shaped batteries, onto the camera itself, as opposed to having it hanging from a cable. If you don't have one of those though, there is the connector here. It's just a 4-pin connector, as I mentioned. And as long as you have like a cable and a way of connecting your battery to that, then you can just plug it in that way instead of needing to use the battery sleeve. But the battery sleeve is just, it's so nice and it's so convenient, and it just makes the camera kind of all one piece. And we just connect this in, and then the battery is running off of the cable that's plugged in here. The camera also has a fuse in here, so you can unscrew this area and that is marked as fuse, and then you can replace the fuse if the fuse blows on the camera. On this side of the camera is also where video taps would be installed, and you have this area which is the iris control, and it changes the amount of light that is entering for the little video assist unit that would be attached to the side here. So just like on a digital camera where you could plug in an HDMI to a monitor and then people can see what the camera is seeing, you can do that on certain film cameras. Video taps are things that are professionally installed and they're not just accessories that you can buy and plug in. This specific model here at Lift has a very dated video tap. It is a CCD video camera module that's on here, and it has pretty dated connectors, so it doesn't play nicely with modern monitors. But there are places that will do very, very nice HD video taps that have outputs for like SDI, and you can work with better monitors, and the display is full color and looks amazing. But it goes onto this side of the camera and it has some different controls depending on the type of video tap that you have installed on your camera. There's also the two lights on this side of the camera here, and the yellow one will indicate when it's running. The red one will only flash when it's not in sync. So you can see it just as the camera is starting up. It will red, then it will stop being red, turn off, and only the yellow one is running to indicate that the camera is running and it's running in sync. And if you're on test, then this one will be flashing. So once it achieves sync sound speed, the red light will go off and only this yellowish light will stay on to indicate that the camera is running. On top of the XTR PROD model, there's this handle that has a few little things going on for it. There's this piece that flips up, and this is where you would connect like a measuring tape to measure off your focus distance. And that is because it is entirely in line with the film plane. So that's where you would just flip that up as a way of like throwing a little measuring tape around it. Also at the back of the handle are two little tools that you can remove to do some different things to the camera. One of these tools is for adjusting the shutter angle inside of the camera. I'm not going to show this off because it's not something that is very commonly needed to be done, and there's only a few different options for the shutter angle that you can switch it to, and it's intended not for drastically changing your exposure, it is intended for shooting monitors and reducing flicker. Using the tool, the shutter angle in the camera can be adjusted between 180 degrees, 172.8 degrees, 150 degrees, and 144 degrees. Further details on this can be found in the manual. But if you're renting one of these cameras from somebody and you know that you might need to change the shutter angle, talk to the person that you're renting it from first, because if you're inexperienced, you do something wrong, you break one of these cameras, you're gonna have a real bad day, because there's only a number of places in the world that are able to service and repair these cameras these days. So the blue tool that unscrews from the handle is for changing the shutter angle, and the black tool is the one that you use for swapping out the viewfinder screens, which, as I mentioned as well, is not something that I'm gonna be covering here, but they are hidden inside of the handle of the camera if somebody needs to use them. Down here are two more LEMO connectors, a LEMO 8 and a LEMO 6 pin connector, and they're also for different accessories, things that, like the time code and Aaton code stuff, you probably won't encounter anymore, but some of them are for like controllers and additional like speed units, things like that, that run separately from the camera. And there's also a little connector down here, and that is for like remotes and triggers. And one of the nicest accessories for the Aatons are the wooden hand grip controls. So on top here, you have a little switch that toggles between run and test. So you don't need to use the actual physical controls on the side of the camera. You just slide these onto the rails. You can tighten it up here, and then you would plug it into the camera here, and you're able to hold it like this. These cameras are incredibly friendly for going handheld, shoulder mounted, because of the way that they're designed. And especially like hearing the original designer of these cameras talk about it, it has like a funny little kind of inspiration for how it was created.
The viewfinder here and the camera there, so you are with the person you shoot. That was the Aaton principle. And the shape was because of my cat on the shoulder.
And that is the Aaton XTR PROD. Once you're done shooting on these cameras, all you have to do is flip this silver switch forward, and then the magazine will remove and slide out. And that's all you have to do to unload it. Once you're done shooting, actually, you will be able to hear the film finish up. You'll see the counter on the side hit 0 anyways, and you'll hear the film go through the magazine and come all the way onto the take-up side. And then in complete darkness, you will unload it from the core, and you can see that it will be one roll. And you would only open this in complete darkness at this point. But the other side will be empty once you're done shooting. There also won't still be film at the front of your magazine. But if we run this magazine out, we'll be able to hear what it sounds like when it finishes. So it might make a little bit of a freaky noise for a second as it's just finishing up, but as long as you're not hearing like a repeated like grinding scary noise, then you're fine. The film is run up entirely through and is now safely on the core in the take-up side. So you go into the dark, take that out, transfer it to the can, get it to the lab. The XTR PROD is amazing, but very likely it's a camera you will be renting and not buying for yourself. These cameras typically sell for over $20,000 or $30,000 depending on where you're buying them from. And even the XTR or XTR Plus will be around maybe $10,000, probably more, depending again where you're looking. For most people, these are rental cameras because they are production quality cameras. So the Aaton XTR, definitely one of the nicest 16mm cameras just ever made. And during its time, it was super popular for like documentary crews, especially because you can get it pretty lightweight. Just throw it on your shoulder, start walking around through like a jungle or the desert or wherever else people make documentaries, and you're pretty much good to go. A number of months ago, I shot a little project with some friends on an Aaton XTR, but we didn't use this production model. We used another one that's also available at Lyft. It is slightly different, and it looks very, very similar because it is same magazines, but just a few different options on it. It's a little more limiting. I believe it's the Aaton XTR Plus as opposed to the Aaton XTR PROD. Also, this is a switch that goes back and forth, and this is just buttons. And this is an ARRI lens mount, which, as I said, amazing lenses you can get for it. This is a little more of a limiting Aaton bayonet mount, I believe. So there's a zoom lens that comes with the camera when it's rented from Lyft, but just overall a little less versatile than working with like ARRI prime lenses on the PROD model. But I wanted to show how incredibly friendly it is to throw on the actual shoulder and going. So all you have to do is just kind of set up your viewfinder in a comfortable way, and it is so nice to just throw on the shoulder and work with this way. This Aaton XTR lacks some features of the PROD model. You can't adjust the shutter angle, and as I mentioned, this has an Aaton bayonet mount, though some people may have versions that do take PL lenses or have converted to just other lens mounts. There are also less options for the display. The magazine loading and general use of the camera, though, do remain the same. So several months ago, I shot a little project on this camera. We shot some really old, just expired black and white negative film that I was sent last year or 2 years ago now. I believe it was some old Russian-made stuff from the 80s or the 90s. It's got a really kind of faded, inconsistent look to it. I shot it, and my friend Jordan directed it. We made some Super 8 shorts a little while ago. If you want to see that short project, it is available on the channel right now as well. So there's a link down below. There's a thing you can click on at the end of the video. Go check that out. But I want to show off a little bit of the footage just in this video as an example. I shot this, it was double perf film, so it has perforations down both sides. So Super 16 exposes over some of that area. Not really. You don't usually want to shoot double perf film in a Super 16 camera, but it's not a bad thing. It just awkwardly intersects with the frame because of the perforations. But all modern Kodak 60mm film is single perf, super friendly for using in Super 16 cameras, unless you, I believe, special order some double perf film from them. But there are places that make double perf film, such as the Film Photography Project, that offer that stuff for older cameras, things from like 30s, 40s, around that period of time when pretty much all cameras took double perf 16mm film. As a quick size example as well, this is the Aaton XTR PROD beside a Bolex. So Both great cameras, very different kind of styles of shooting and what they are capable of doing. The Aaton XTR PROD, of course, amazing for bigger projects, working with recording audio on set. The Bolex, just an all-time classic. This is what it sounds like at like a high frame rate in comparison earlier when I was showing this at a higher frame rate. Yeah, pretty loud. So, you know, just very, very different in terms of construction and what they would be used for. 100 feet, 16 millimeter internal load, 400 foot magazines. And this is the Aaton beside an RESR2. So same kind of intended for similar uses. They're both kind of production quality cameras, 400 foot magazine, 400 foot magazine. This one's a little more compact, but definitely not as friendly right out of the box to kind of throw on your shoulder because it's just a super flat base. Similar in broad strokes, but I do believe that the Aaton is quite a bit nicer. And I'll explore the SR2 in depth in another video. Thanks so much for checking this out. As I mentioned, watch the little short that Jordan wrote and directed and I shot using a camera like this, but not this specific one. You can find links down in the description below for Lift, as I mentioned, which is I'm wearing the shirt, I'm using the cameras, I'm using resources and facilities and stuff here for videos, which is amazing artist resource in Toronto. You can also find ways to support the channel. Patreon, there's a bit of merch available, some stuff like that. And if you're not interested in supporting the channel through that way, you can support it just by watching the videos, subscribing to this stuff, liking it, throw a like on the thumbs up thing down there, and just share it around, tell your friends, tell your mom and dad, aunt and uncle, everybody. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.